Hi, welcome to our Shadows and Skulls art project, an introduction to India ink. To participate in this project, you will need a variety of materials. You will need 8 by 10 inch watercolor paper, a pencil and an eraser, a scrap of watercolor paper for testing, a ruler, a paint palette, black India ink in any brand or a color of your choice, a cup of water and a paper towel, paintbrushes of various sizes, a dip pen holder, and nibs. The nibs can come in various sizes and shapes as well. What you'll do with the nib is you will tuck it right into the holder and you'll be able to use this for fine line detailing. Okay, to get started, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to draw a 1-inch grid on our 8-inch by 10-inch paper. We will be making a mark at every 1 inch. Line your ruler up with the edge of your paper somewhere towards the top and make a mark at the 1, 2, 3, all the way to the 9. You don't have to make a mark at the 10, that's the end of the paper. Then slide your ruler straight down and repeat the same step. By making the marks at the top and at the bottom, you are able to create a nice vertical straight line just by connecting those marks that have been measured out evenly. Make sure to draw light. You should have results that look something like this. Next, turn your paper and you're going to repeat the same process going in the opposite direction. Make sure you make marks at the top and at the bottom, and then you connect the marks with your ruler, drawing lightly, creating nice, neat, straight vertical lines. Remember, if your lines are not straight, then your drawing won't be accurate. Here are the results. You should have 10 columns down and 8 columns across. Okay, now that we have our final paper ready to go, we need to make sure that our reference image is also ready. You will need to have taken a photo of a skull on your own with a light source and a background, or you should have chosen a skull image from my collection. Once you have your image cropped appropriately, you want to put an 8 by 10 grid over the skull to match the grid that's on our final paper. We will use this grid over our reference image to help us draw accurately on our final paper. When drawing from a grid, you want to draw one square at a time. The point of the grid is not to draw the entire image the way you see the image, but to draw it in smaller parts, and those small parts come together to create an accurate image. Draw what you see in each square. Make sure that you draw what you see and not what you know. When I draw, I try to look ahead to the next square. So if I'm creating a rounded edge, I want to think about where does the end of this line hit on the next square. I look at where that placement is, and then I try to make sure that my line curves to that place. Some other things you might want to consider as you're drawing from a grid is look at corners. Does the line come close to a corner? What kind of shape is being formed in the negative space of that box? Do you see a triangle, a rectangle? Is that line about to hit the center of the square? Or is it above the center or below the center? Those are all things you want to think about as you draw the lines that you see within each square. Remember to draw one square at a time. Sometimes what might help is to block off all the other squares by laying a piece of paper over your artwork, ensuring that you're really just looking at what you see in each square. It might also help you to number the boxes along the top and down the side. Whatever method you choose, when you draw from a grid, make sure that you draw lightly. Something else you might want to consider is drawing the entire outline of the skull first and then going in with the details. Sometimes that helps you better visualize what you're drawing when you have the outline placed. Here you can see that I did the entire outline of the skull, then I went in to do the eyes and the nose, and I saved the teeth for last. I did, however, map out where the teeth go by drawing curved lines, and that allows me to see where that placement's going to be. Once I've finished everything, then I can go in with the teeth. Now the teeth are going to be the hardest thing you draw on a skull, most likely. Try not to draw what you know about teeth or what you think about teeth. Just draw the shapes that you see. And of course, draw light. When you have all of the basic shapes and features drawn out, take a moment and look at the detailing of the skull. Maybe there's some last-minute shapes that you want to fill in before you begin painting, such as shadow shapes or imperfections. Having these sections marked out now will help you later on when you start adding in paint. Okay, if you feel good about your drawing, maybe you've received some teacher approval, you're then ready to erase the grid. India ink is known as a transparent medium, so any pencil lines left behind might show through your painting. So spend the time now erasing all of the grid lines. And if you feel like your drawing is too dark, maybe you pressed too hard with a pencil, take a moment and lighten those lines by erasing them. All right, now we're ready for India ink. You will need a paint palette, paint brushes, a cup of water, and a paper towel. You'll also need a strip of watercolor paper so that you can kind of test some of your values. And of course, you will need India ink. The first thing I suggest doing is pouring a little bit of water inside some of the little cups on your palette. Next, go ahead and open up your India ink. My India ink came with a dropper. Usually I can soak up some of the India ink and drop it right into the cup, but I've used this India ink a lot, so it's down towards the bottom. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to take a dry paintbrush and I'm going to dip it into the India ink, and then I'm going to dab it onto my palette. What you don't ever want to do is take a wet paintbrush and dip it into your India ink container, because that's going to dilute the India ink. So each time I dip my paintbrush into the India ink, I need to make sure that I dry off the paintbrush. Okay, so I have a cup that has pure India ink, and then I have 2 cups that have water with some India ink. I'm going to test them out onto a strip of paper to see how the values look. They're pretty dark when they first go on, and they get lighter as they dry. I want some lighter values, so one thing I noticed is that my water cup immediately took on the India ink. So I just poured the water straight into a cup, and now I have a lighter value. I'm going to make another cup with water, add a little bit more India ink to that, creating a little bit darker value. Now I have a nice range of values from light to medium to dark. Now I'm ready to paint. Once again, I'm going to bring up my skull reference image. And as I paint, I'm going to refer back to the image constantly, making sure that I'm capturing the values and shadows that I see in the image. It can be a little scary to lay down the first mark on your paper. I suggest starting with an area you know will be easy. In this case, I'm going to start with the eyes. It's always a good idea to start with lighter values. You can always go back and layer them to get darker values if needed later on. So I'm going to start to layer my skull with washes. I'm using the tip of my paintbrush to create nice clean edges. I almost trace the shape that I'm working in with the paintbrush. And before anything is dry, I quickly fill in the rest of the space. Now looking at my reference image, I know that this eye is really dark. So I'm actually going to try the wet into wet technique by dropping in some pure India ink into the wash I just laid down. To make it a smoother transition, I'm going to try to feather in the value from the dark to the lights, creating a nice smooth transition. If you've ever used watercolor before, you know that India ink is very similar. One thing you have to do with watercolor that you also have to do with India ink is you have to allow dry time. If I don't allow dry time in between the section I'm working on and the section that's directly next to it, what will happen is those two sections will bleed into each other. So if that's not a look you're going for, you're going to have to either allow your work to dry before you go on, or you have to work your way around the painting. Work on sections that don't touch other sections. Leave white space between what you're working on, which will allow one section to dry as you're working on another. Throughout this demo, you'll see me doing that. I start with one section, then I move to another section that's on the opposite side, and then I go back to the section I was originally working on once I feel like it's dry, and so on. And as I'm working, I'm constantly referring back to my reference image. I'm looking for values, I'm looking for shadows, I'm looking for details. I'm really trying to lay down a value foundation throughout the piece with the understanding that I can go back in and layer my values to get a bolder, higher contrast throughout at a later time. Here's a good example of me accidentally not allowing a section to fully dry, causing some bleeding. If that happens, what I suggest doing is just getting a little piece of paper towel and kind of dabbing at it a little bit while it's still wet to kind of lift away the India ink. Okay, so as I move on to other details like teeth, I've switched paintbrushes so that I can get really nice clean details, especially around the gums or the areas around the teeth. You'll also notice that as I'm painting, my arm is resting on the table. This is a really good idea if you want a nice steady hand as you're working, but you have to be careful that you don't accidentally place your hand in any wet paint. Always be aware of what is wet on your paper and where you're resting your hand as you work. Okay, this is something I definitely want to mention. Teeth, although we recognize teeth as being white, they're not paper white. So when you look at your skull, whatever skull you've chosen to paint, the teeth should not be left as white paper. You have to paint the shadows that you see on the teeth. So the white teeth are going to be in shadow just like your white skull is in shadow. And once again, you see that I'm kind of moving my way around the skull. So I left off with the teeth and now I'm back into the shadows on the cheekbones, and now I'm back down into the chin area, and then I'll move my way back up. This allows dry time. So feel free to work yourself around the paper in whatever order you feel is most appropriate so that while one section is drying, you can still be working. I think it's also important to note that contrast adds a lot of visual interest to your work. Don't be afraid to go dark. The darker your work, the bolder it will appear. So layer those dark shadows until you get it nice and dark. Remember, the India ink goes on dark, but it dries light. So you may have to do multiple layers to get it to the right boldness you're looking for. Okay, I'm coming down to the end. I think I have a nice range of values throughout my skull. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a background. Now, when you took your photo, or if you borrowed a photo from my collection, you'll notice that there is a background. In some cases, the light source created almost an entirely black background, and in some cases, you might see drapery and different folds and transitions of value. The photo I chose has an almost solid black background, but I don't think that's as interesting as creating a background that has some different values or some different transitions. So even though my image shows an all black background, I'm going to try to create some value transitions. I'm going to make it dark towards the bottom and lighter towards the top. The boldness of the black background also makes the skull really pop. All right, here is the final result of my skull painted with washes and layers of India ink only. Now you may like the look of this and maybe you're done. Or if you would like to try some extra detailing, let's work with the dip pen. Now the dip pen is a really fun tool to use. You will hold the dip pen like you would a paintbrush or a pencil. But you want to turn the nib so that it faces down towards your paper. So the curved part of the nib faces the table. To get a bolder line with the dip pen, press down. To get a thinner line, you don't have to press very hard. What you will do is you'll take your dry dip pen and dip it straight into the India ink container, straight into the pure ink. I do suggest practicing with the dip pen a few times on scratch paper before starting on your skull, just to get a feel for it. When you're ready, you can go ahead and start adding in some detailing to your skull. Just make sure that you have your reference image pulled up so you can refer back to that as you work. The dip pen is great for many reasons. It creates clean edges, adds textures, allows for more contrast and detailing, and the pen techniques that you can add to your work, such as cross-hatching or stippling, really adds a nice texture and interest to your final piece. Watch as I work my way around the skull, adding textures, pen techniques, contrast, and detailing. The hardest part of working with a dip pen is knowing when to stop. There's so much you can do with it, and it's so fun to use. But I think I am about done, so I'm going to call it. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video demo helpful. Please note that in the description below, you'll find links to the full lesson as well as the skull collections. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.